All right. Welcome today. We have Martha that's going to take us on an exploration of natural wool colors. And I feel like, Martha, you need no introduction, but you are owner of Black Sheep Farm and you raise award-winning merino sheep and are on the board of the Fibershed. And we are so happy you're here to do this for us.
Well, welcome everyone, and those who will watch later too. I raise my merino flock here in Northern Virginia, Northern Loudoun County, and I have done that for a long time, and the great thing about my background is in journalism, so lifelong learning is one of the advantages of that profession. And because I do the publication of the Maryland Sheep Readers and did several other sheep publications before that, it gives me the opportunity to just keep on doing that learning and share it with people in the publications I do. So here's a couple of a little group of lambs that sort of exhibit some of those colors we're going to be talking about. We all know white. The little lamb in the back middle is a natural silver. Then there's a black one, and then in front that's a little more lamb. So what we'll touch on today is starting with wild sheep, which is where our sheep genetics come from, what happened with domestication and what we saved and what we selected against in different breeds, and what variations happen after that. Also, we'll touch a bit on environmental effects of what that has on colored wool, which you see more easily in colored fiber than in white fiber. We'll just briefly touch on some colored genetics and commercial uses for colored wool, what our wool palette is, and and then show you kind of what's available in the Chesapeake Fiber Shed, and then we'll move to some upcoming events of interest. So color sheep, wild sheep come in many colors, and based on many factors, what their natural environment was, predator protection, etc. And from those wild varieties, humans domesticated in various places across the globe. Some of those wild species, and the mouflon, which had several different subspecies, and that's in A here. That's the one that research shows was probably the progenitor of most of our domesticated breeds. And here's just images of a range of some of those primitive breeds. Characteristics of wild sheep are that they were dual coated. They have those outer coarse guard hairs and a finer undercoat for insulation. Had short tails, and females often grow horns. And today's primitive breeds, such as Icelandic Shetland and Soay and some others, still shed their fleeces, although they're usually shorn before that happens. They retain those short tails, and the ewes still may have horns, and their natural colors have been kept as is, and selected for their color range, or their color limitation. The Soay sheep is just a brown sheep. But humans selected to retain subsequent natural mutations that happen, such as no shedding, no outer guard hairs, and a much denser fleece. And they selected qualities which allowed sheep to survive in every climates we humans have populated, which is, from the Arctic to the equator. Domestic selection. So primarily, as I indicated, it was for survivability. In far northern regions, small sheep with those coarse retained those coarse coats, and the insulating undercoats survived better. Those dual coated fleeces also were useful in arid desert climates that were both hot and cold. And that coarse fiber was very useful for the hard wearing items that they needed, especially the migratory groups. In Mongolia, you see the yurt here reconstruction being done. And they used, made saddles, yurts, and other things from that fiber. And then, in Britain and Ireland, still high rainfall, but much milder temperatures. Um, uh, the breeds they were selecting for, there was so much moisture and mild weather, and they didn't want those fleeces to felt. So their wool fiber had developed characteristics that made them not as readily able to felt. And having more lanolin in those fibers had other good uses, such as the Irish fisherman's sweater is one good example. It was spun and woven with the lanolin retained in it, which not only kept the fishermen warm, but the lanolin kind of helped repel the water too. And then as humans further selected, we selected some grains, like for corn is a great example of selecting a grain where all the kernels didn't just fall off and they were held on to the ear. And we eventually kind of did the same kind of thing with sheep and selected those that did not shed their fleeces. And meaning, that they didn't have to go around pulling up bits of fiber that the sheep rubbed off on rocks and shrubs and all that, and they could just harvest it all at once. And then denser fleeces meant more pounds of fiber per sheep, and also that density helped the vegetable and other contaminants out. And then finer fleeces with the fiber diameter smaller and smaller made them much softer to wear against the skin. So we did all those things. Early textiles. Here you'll see, this image of monks, and which they were supposed to demonstrate poverty and humility, and so their garments were rough, and those undyed wools would have been were chosen for them, and of course they had different colors according to whichever monk you were, but Franciscans wore brown. And at left or at right, you'll see the really amazing woven scarf, skirt, and some skins that were from a 2,000-year-old bog body that was Danish, from a Danish bog. And then in Persia, you see a fragment here of some textiles with what looks like natural colors. Humans being what they are, wealth and social status was soon reflected. And some of you are probably familiar with Monty Python and the Holy Grail, which has several very funny bits about how you can tell a king from just the peasants. Their clothes were clean, to paraphrase. And white was, who could afford white? The kings could. And as civilization advanced, dyes and textile fabrication techniques advanced. Those lighter and whiter wools, which could be dyed and overdyed, became highly valued. And in many places across the globe, white sheep were selected for, and eventually colored sheep selected against. Here I'm putting in the image of this book, which gives us a really fascinating study of how textiles develop, wool, linen, cotton, etc., and synthetics later on. But it's really amazing how textiles really did make our world. It was the origin of banking, and trade issues. And it's just really fascinating. I do recommend it. And just one little case history I found in Portugal in the 1870s. They had a lot of merinos, and most of them were black. Um, but with the modern textile industry, that their numbers began to decrease. And it was only a quarter of the merino population in 1955, and then dwindled further. Now, their efforts to retain those flocks and find a way to increase their value. Now I'm gonna segue to color genetics. In January, Polly Matzinger gave 2 days, 2 talks on wool genetics, which was really fascinating. And I'm just going to touch on a very few things that she discussed here, and these are images from her slides. So there's 2 colored pigments in the genetics of sheep, which are the result in color. Eumelanin and pheomelanin, and you can see that the eumelanin is for black and browns, and wools that aren't really white, that are white and red, are from that pheomelanin. But of course, it's very complex. When you look at the dominant, recessive and dominant colors, so here's a picture of melanocyte, the cell that looks like the little hand, and the cuticle cells it touches those cuticle cells, and the melanin from those cells will then go into the cuticle and be expressed in the fiber. And in the upper left here, ACIP is the place on the gene, the element of the protein that says stop, no color. And but if you have one of those ACIP genes turned on, you can still get color. It will probably just be a little less color. And think maybe instead of a dark black, you'll get a gray. But then there's another kind of recessive black where both those ACIP genes are turned off. Then the black gets to go, and you'll get a darker fiber. Type 2 is when those genes are dominant, and once again, the different protein affects whether that is a lighter colored fiber, or if you have one copy of it, one normal copy of it, it's black, and if you have 2 normal, it's always black. So pretty complicated and fascinating. And of course, in addition to color, it's like, as the embryo develops, where do those melanocytes form and go up to the skin, and what do they represent? And of course, you see here that there's a huge range of variation in what happens. This sheep at the top right has that a little bit of he didn't get those melanocytes around his nose, and then this right beneath his eye, you see that little white patch. Those are called teardrops, and that's sort of a characteristic that happens in various color breeds. And on the lower, you get I believe this is a what am I saying? Gotland, yeah. And black hair and a gray fleece. And one thing she pointed out is interesting, not for doing for fiber, but the hairs grow a lot more slowly than wool fibers. So you see this dark black face on this animal, which has gray fleece, and because those hairs grow slowly, the melanocytes have more chance to get in every little bit of that hair fiber as it comes out, but the faster growing wool, those melanocytes are going to be spread along it in this particular animal. Then you got spotting, then you got just sheep that are kind of happy in different places. Morit is also complicated. In 2006, there's a Cornell doctoral student who couldn't get his institution to pay for genetic color studies, but he did crowdfund funding to get that done. And he tested a little under 500 sheep, more at sheep, and looked at the genome. Now, you know, the sheep genome is mapped, and you can, he described it as you can, you know, go online and look at it as if it were Google Maps. And he, all those blood tests, and he found out where on the genes that those that more it was expressed, because it is a double recessive. The each parent has to carry a copy of the morit. And so there's a lot more research to be done, but I put the link here in the bottom of that has an abstract of his work, and it was also, the full thing was published in a international journal. Of course, it's not just those, you know, brown or black or red, it's everything in between. And we don't have very much research on what accounts for all the differences in shades and dark and light. There's some, and you know, the fading gene accounts for some of this, but it's probably just as complicated as all the rest of color genetics. In some breeds, as you see here in the center, lambs are born, Tunis and caracal Murat lambs are born with this chocolatey brown color, but they both fade as their fleeces fade as they grow up. And on the right, you'll see a merino with pims, which is those little tiny spots, and spotting. And this particular ewe has not only black but silver, which is kind of interesting. Environmental effects. Sun bleaches the tips of those colored fleeces. And you can see here on the left, this ewe is wearing a cover where the cover doesn't cover her fleece. You see that bleaching at the tips. Of course, when you clean and spin that, you're going to get still a lovely heathered kind of yarn. But you'll get more uniformity with the part that was covered. And the covered part, of course, will also not have any weathering on the tips. In the center, you'll see, I haven't proved this, but this is a ram I have who has these sort of variation along his fleece. And from what I understand, that's probably dietary changes and what he was eating at the time. And this is a perfectly strong fleece. Those pale areas are not weak. So it was probably just a difference of what his forage contained in the way of minerals, etc., that made the fleece look this lovely variation of pattern, or you know, color. And then you can also get some lack of pigmentation if there's a deficiency of minerals. And on the right, it's a copper deficiency in Shetland sheep. And there are so many patterns, and which is why lambing season for natural colored sheep breeders is so exciting, because we just don't know what we're going to get. There's a resurgence of natural colored fibers, as we all have probably noted. More than 50 years ago, spinners were showing up the Maryland wool pool, and they were thrilled to be able to get natural colored fleeces. And so many of them started showing up that the buyer of the wool which had contracted to buy the wool pool, started getting a little ticked off that all these spinners were taking the best fleeces. So that is at the point at which Maryland Sheep Festival was held in 73. And then several years later, the Natural Colored Wool Growers formed to help advance and improve the quality of those natural colored fleeces. And it also, of course, registers them and has shows, etc. All right, my guardian dog's bothering me. So we have a really wonderful broad color palette to create with. And you can just get a lot without, even thinking about dye.
Wow.
In the commercial market, slowly but surely, it has become a niche spot for natural colored wools. Probably 20 years ago, I was driving with family up from Missouri to Nebraska, and there was a Pendleton outlet, and I was thrilled to find a blanket that was made with both white and naturally colored wool. On the left here, this is a couple of women in Australia who are really being able to create a great demand for what they create with their natural colored sheep. And then these others are a few other examples of natural colors incorporated into textiles and garments. On the right here, you'll see that this was a little post that was on the Colored Merino Collective on Facebook that he had found in Australia of a wool-rich garment available that used black fleece. And then in our Fibershed, here's one example of someone who's done the whole farm to closet thing with her merino sheep. Lots of natural colored merinos. And her wool is scoured, spun, and woven at the American Woolens mill in Connecticut, and then sent to New York where she partners with a designer who makes garments for the high-end market. I think the skirt here is upwards of $600, but it's beautiful. Okay, then we move to how do you get some of that fiber, and where do you go to get it in our Fibershed? We have rolled out this year our Chesapeake Fibershed resource directory, and to help makers and others find the kind of fleece that they're looking for, by breed and color. And if you go on the resource directory on the website, you'll be able to select what you're looking for, and then up will come the breeders who grow that kind of fleece, and a map to show where they're located. Those who are our members will have a separate page describing their farm and what they produce. And we are working and encouraging producers and makers and teachers to take our survey and sign up and become members. There are several levels of membership, so that we can get you on this directory and make even better connections between producers and buyers. This is just a very few of some of the producers in the Chesapeake Fibershed who are providing a lot of different kinds of colored yarn. Simple Hill is down near Harrisonburg in Virginia. Budding Creek is in Frederick, and Shepherd's Hay is in Comus. That's also been the location of a couple of our sustainable cloth challenges. So you can see she really has a complete palette there. Upcoming events might be of interest to you. This coming May, at the Maryland Sheep and Wool Festival, Melissa Weaver Dunning will give a lecture, The History of Textiles. I'm looking forward to that. And because it is really a fascinating area. And then every 5 years there's a World Congress on Colored Wool. I have a few of their past proceedings, symposium proceedings, which are usually full of articles on genetics and other aspects of natural colored wool around the whole world. Um, and the last one was in New Zealand, and a couple of people who went there raised their hand to help the next one happen in this country. So we have started some preliminary discussions with kind of looks like a green light with the Maryland Sheep and Wool Festival to have it here in 2029. So stay tuned for that. That's about all I have. And so if anybody has any questions, I can try to answer them, or I can try to find out and get you some answers. And if you want any of the links or more information, I'm happy to email that.
Thanks, Martha. I have a question. You say that it sounds like there are so many factors that influence. What kind of records do you have to keep when you breed, and what's the probability that you get the color you want?
Um, you know, maybe someday you'll be able to genetically test your sheep and know exactly what they're carrying. Um, but that's probably a really long way off. Um, but what I will do, I use a flock management software called Flock Filer. And so I will note, obviously I note what colors each lamb is. And what makes it a little challenging is that when the lamb is first born, just like we see in these breeds like the Tunis, so you'll say, oh, that one's black. Um, but sometimes when they're born, they're coming out of their skin is those primary follicles. Um, and then those are shed, and their secondary follicles, which are clustered all around those primary follicles, start to grow. And so you may see changes in the color of their fiber as they do grow. Um, and I'll often have lambs that I think, oh, they're black. But then I part their fleece at 3 months. It's like, no, they're not, they're silver. Once I had a pair of ewes who um sisters who I thought were black, and I registered them as black. And the next spring, when we prepared to show them, I parted the fleece, and each of them had this distinct color change to brown. Um, so that was really fascinating. Also, if I have a white sheep with lots of little white spotting, as they grow, um, what tends to happen is what was the first white follicles will turn black. And if they have little spots, those little spots will become big spots. So I note that in my software. And if I have a ewe that, say I have a white ewe that I breed with a ram, and she has a Morit lamb, I'll know, wow, okay, you have one copy of the Morit gene. And if I have a silver ram and he has a Mort ram, then I know he does too. Um, so that helps a bit. And the silvers, Philip Spangenberg is a emeritus professor of genetics at animal genetics at Virginia Tech. He's done a lot of research on this, and I read an article from him about what I'm seeing as my silvers, which are expressed kind of on a continuum between what looks like a really, really dark brown to something that is a really pale, warm silver. And he said that is a gene which just is expressed along that continuum. And so I record when I get the color that I like, or that just I will just identify that, and that just kind of helps me after the fact map what I have and gives me a little prediction of what I might get when I cross two different sheep. I have one white sheep that ram that I use, and he will throw those black and white spotted lambs. So I know his color is close to the surface there. And I had a one white ewe lamb born this year that She's all white except one brown, one ear is moored. It's the only sign that she's got that moored gene in her. It's kind of an after the fact, I know there are certainly people who know a lot more about sheep genetics than I do and who've, taken those genetic classes in school and probably have a much more precise way of figuring out what's going on than I do. Um,
Wow, that's fascinating. Makes you
Yeah.
really appreciate the color.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I was going to ask the same question, like what was the most surprising, sort of colorway that has appeared on your farm and
One thing I haven't had, but I think I will, I haven't had badger face. So there's badger face and reverse badger face. Badger face um, is the animal, has a black face and has these kind of white stripes, and they're dark on top but white on the belly and can be white on the legs. And then the reverse badger face is reverse. They're white. I think they'll have some pigment on their face, but they're white on top and have a black belly. I think that's a common kind of similar kind of patterning that you see in Barbados blackbelly sheep, um, which have that pattern. Um, but I just got a Moor ram from Oregon, and he has a lot of that badger face in his pedigree. So I'm expecting to see that soon.
Wow.
well, I was really also very interested just to hear sort of the story about the merinos in Portugal and how numbers dropped down as interest in the colored fleeces diminished. And then what role like hand spinners have had in this sort of new or the trend towards yeah
Yeah,
s-
I
mm,
I need to find out more about that. But there is an Italian wool company which once again creates very high-end goods. And I had this earlier slice, Loro Piana.
Mhm.
Um, and I think they even have outlets. I mean, that's not outlets, but
They have a
brand.
store in DC.
Right, yeah.
mm,
And Black Merino has been part of their company for a while. Um, and I think with, that because people sort of were kind of piggybacking onto the local food movement and with the local fiber movement and the variation and not using dyes and getting a rich palette of colors, I think that, you know, there's certainly potential for those black merinos to find a great market. Uh,
mm.
it's interesting to see that when I was looking at primitive textiles, of course, uh, you can buy yourself a recreation of a Franciscan monk's woolen cloak because of the popularity of medieval reenactments, etc. So, I saw this one side. It has, here's the original garment, and you send them your measurements, and you too can pretend you're a Franciscan monk. Uh, so,
Anything to keep the wool out there, right?
Right.
yeah. So,
And they
um,
probably weren't wearing merino.
no, it was probably really, really, really coarse stuff.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Um, so the part that the literal hair shirt probably. Um,
My gosh.
Yeah.
I had not thought about that, and I'm thinking, oh man.
Sort of goes with the territory.
um, so
Interesting.
yeah, so the first another surprise story was that my first merinos I at the Maryland Sheep and Wool I bought a black ram and a black ewe from a Michigan breeder, and they were my first black merinos, and I was so excited. And I brought them home and I bred them, and out popped this white ewe lamb, and I was
Wow.
like, oh. How did that happen? So yeah. So we could, as we now know after my talk, that it was a non-dominant
Mhm.
recessive gene in those parents. Um, but Anyway, yeah, so you will get those genetics are hiding in there, and you know, one of the great things with merinos is there is a huge range of potential color in them. Some of the research I was reading, or it was actually Dr. Posberg's research. He also in his research tested a bunch of Jacobs, which are not known to carry any mort, and his genetic testing of them confirmed that they none of the ones he tested had that had a mort gene. But they do have that lilac strain, and I'm not sure whether that is the back, you know, when I'm referring to if the ASIP protein gene, if they have just one copy of the stop color, that they can get a paler version of the color. So maybe that's what's going on there. Of course,
I've never heard of a lilac sheep. What does that
well,
mean?
they're silver, but
Okay.
they call it lilac.
Okay. Thanks.
And what I've seen in my merinos, most of my silvers are really kind of a very warm silver, kind of a pewter color.
Mhm.
But I have occasionally seen in merinos what they're called blue, which is a very cool steely silver. Um, and in one of my ram lambs this year, from a white ram, I thought, okay, you're definitely black. He's black and white spotted. But then I parted his fleece, of course, after I sent off his registration papers, and he's definitely got white fibers within that black. So once again, so it is not a uniform color fiber. He's got white fibers and black fibers mixed in. So it's all different.
Hmm.
Well, it's exciting that we have access to so many variations in our region. I mean, just seeing all the, yeah, the
Yeah,
potential.
I'm really looking forward to what the sustainable cloth turns up. I'll try to come up with something.
I
Yeah,
hope so.
the pressure's on.
And I know you'll be able to.
Wow.
Mhm.
Any other questions? Mandy, anything?
Just thank you, Martha. That was really interesting.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Great.
Yeah.
All
It
right.
reminded me as well, I think, on a visit to Mount Vernon's flock, they have the Hog Island sheep, and I was told by someone they had a shearing demonstration and they had some lambs and they were spotted, and I was told that they also outgrow those spotted markings and become a single color as they grow. So that's another unusual um, yeah, sort of pattern trait.
Yeah, one thing I
Interesting.
wish I understood more is I read in the ASI book of how fetal follicle development proceeds. They'll have this first the primary follicles grow in the fetus, and then they to create the cells for the secondary follicles, which are much finer than the primaries. And you know, the number of follicles per square inch by breed varies by orders of magnitude. A fine wool merino may have 56,000 follicles per square inch of skin, I have read.
Whoa.
And for example, a Scottish blackface may be 5,600. Um, so, you know, Scottish blackface, of course, are living in Scotland. Merinos will not survive in Scotland.
Mm.
It's too wet, and that dense fleece will do them no good up there. So, what I didn't mention, it's not specifically to colored wool, but there was some interesting research um, on wool crimp, and there have been two competing theories with what makes the crimp. Is it two different kinds of cells that grow, meaning that, you know, the fiber grows shorter on one side, which makes that curve, or is it outer cells, do they grow faster than the inner cells? And that's what makes the curve. So that's some research that is out there. I can't remember which one, which one the research showed was likely, but there's so much we don't know about wool.
So Martha, is it the expense that keeps people from genetically testing sheep, or is it just not available?
It's not available. And the research that Posberg did, that's some of the limited genetic genome mapping work that's been done. There's a lot of other genetics work, which it shows us what that could tells us things like why there's some spotting, why there's more, why there's black. But in terms of getting a blood test that says here's all the color genetics hiding in your sheep that you can tease out if you pick the right ram, we don't have that yet.
Thank you.
And it's probably going to have to be crowdfunded again because it's not if that's not going to attract money for you're not going to have a company probably that wants to know that. But once again, I think there's a lot of producers who would, which is how that first research got funded.
I have another question, but it's not specifically to do with color, but just curious about that. You mentioned that merinos don't do well in the wetter climates. How do yours do with humidity and with
Well, it's probably by which merinos that I have selected for.
I see. Yeah.
In Australia, the first artificial insemination I did, I went to the guy who had the semen and I see what he got, and I picked two, and so they turned out to be animals that were from merino studs in very dry areas, and very beautiful, very dense fiber. Did not do as well in the humidity. They tended, because the fibers were so dense, they were prone to kind of yellowing and the start of some bacterial infections in the wool. I mean, it's not, didn't make them ill, but it affected the color of their wool. And after that, I switched to using studs in, I believe it's the southeastern portion of Australia where there is higher rainfall. So, and some of that semen, I would get a slightly bolder crimp, but just as fine, if not finer. And those animals did better in this humidity. And so that's kind of what I've selected for. And then in any, when you're paying attention on your farm, you're just selecting those genetics just by careful observation. And choosing sires that maintain that. And then over time, your sheep, just like anywhere, you pick the ones who do the best in what your climate is. And so without even thinking I'm doing genetic selection, you are, just by what you keep and what you don't.
That's really amazing. Thank you. Yeah. Very organic.
Great. Well,
Please.
I'm going to stop recording.
Okay.